your contracts have teeth. And I get a lot of times what my clients are telling me is like, well, I've had this partner for 10 years. They're a good partner. And I think the step kind of going forward is it's not ugly to write contract terms that are clear.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, we're on for Simply Trade Podcast in for another great show. This is going to be a really good discussion today with all the crazy discussions about tariffs going up, going down, doing this, that. You've got contracts that you've already purchased goods or you set prices, or now there's a change here, whether you're exporting, importing, all that kind of stuff. Lala, I'm looking forward to today's show because we've had a lot of people talking about what the impact is of tariffs and all that, but we're going to get into some nitty gritty of, how to handle some of this, right?
I mean, a lot of the stuff is that, it's coming fast and furious because, there's no waiting period. Sometimes when they're introducing a new tariff or a new change in trade, usually get that usual 30, 60, 90, even longer day waiting period when there's discussions and all that. But these come the day that they're announced almost, and so a lot of shippers, sellers, all that have to almost quickly pivot sometimes. I know sometimes the shipment's on the way on the ocean and things change a couple of times during travel, right? And so you just got to hope that on the day that it lands and you're trying to clear it, that it's what did they used to say? Oh, darn it! I'm sorry, I forgot. I was going to say what they used to say in the Hunger Games. May the odds
Ever be in your favor, or
yeah, there you go. I love it.
That's like the Hunger Games, I guess. May the odds ever be in your favor.
When the tariffs ever be in your favor. Yeah, I love it. We have a great discussion today, folks, and I want to tell you that you obviously heard Marina in there. Marina, how do you say Mekheil?
Mekheil, yes.
Mekheil, excuse me. All right. You know me, folks. I'm going to screw up the name. It's part of my genre, I guess. Anyway, Marina works for the Schultz Trade Law firm. And, she's been on before along with Michelle Schultz, who is a favorite of ours. And we're going to get into some really cool things off camera, off mic. We were talking just a little bit before the show, and I'm going to tell you, Marina was given some examples that were outstanding on what we're going to get into. And so we was like, wait a minute, cheat no fair timeout. Let's stop here and let's get into this. So Marina, why don't you kind of set things up for us here as far as you've got a contract, you got somebody that's buying. In this case, you were representing an importer. What do you do if the shipper, because of these tariffs, all of a sudden tries to shift things around and whatever? Why don't you give a scenario here?
Yeah. So obviously, at Schultz Trade Law, we've dealt with contract negotiations or, reviewed contracts for clients before. But what I'm really seeing lately is our practice to become kind of half and half. We're helping clients navigate the tariffs as importer of record, but we're also kind of dealing with a lot of U.S. importers who are not the importer of record. They're the consignee of the goods. They're the buyer, but their foreign seller has taken on the role of IOR, which is fine. And it's something that, a lot of our clients have done and a lot of, U.S. buyers do. But we're kind of seeing this shift where, we're almost looking to each other for the solution, the the U.S. buyer and the foreign seller, because, it's kind of uncertain times. And even today, there was an announcement that's really positive. We're seeing a trade deal with the U.S. and China, but it almost highlights this even more, that we're in uncertain times. This is a pause for 90 days, these drops in tariffs on China. So we kind of have seen, a look at contracts to say, okay, do you guys discuss what happens when tariffs change? No. Okay, well, let's say you are a US buyer, you're not the IOR, you have no control over your shipment in terms of customs entry and release, but you work in construction, you have your own deadlines to make on a project site. And your IOR, your foreign seller, has enforcement issues and it's now seized at the port for months. And you're not the IOR. You can't talk to the government. You can't make a call and say, these are my goods. I need them released. I have a deadline to meet. So now you're kind of looking at your foreign seller. And now we're dealing with a dispute, a contract dispute. But, the problem is the tariffs because, there's tariffs and now there's high enforcement at CBP. And so our clients are kind of dealing with that. I was telling you guys before off camera, the first kind of big issue we saw was a client, came to us and said, our foreign seller is pointing and saying we need to pay them additional duties that they didn't add into the original purchase price. We took a look at it and it was not a change in law. It was a foreign seller who is the IOR who had an enforcement action. They received a CF-28 from the government and then a CF-29 saying your classification is incorrect and you owe us Section 232 duties. And the foreign seller is saying,
hang on, before you get in there, I want to, because it's almost like we're mixing a few things here, but you're making a very important distinction here. Is that what caused the problem of the goods being held up was an enforcement issue. But more than likely, as you get into this, the seller was trying to do something to more than likely circumvent the higher duties or higher tariffs. And that's where, I understand you got higher tariffs, so you have that scenario. And if it's a higher tariff, they're going to probably pass that on down to the customer, rightly so. However, if it's an enforcement where they're trying to circumvent and doing something, that's a whole different story. But you've got to be on your guard with that. So, all right. So this particular situation you're saying is it was an enforcement. Customs was looking at it. They had the 28, then the 29. 29s, they've taken action on it. And then there's probably more on top of that, right?
There's a lot to talk about with this. I mean, I've been dealing with this since January now, and I could give you several scenarios. I think for me going forward, just to kind of help the viewers out, I'm really only going to discuss when you're not the IOR. You're not the importer of record. You're a U.S. buyer of goods. And either in your contract, you are paying those tariffs as they come down, just trickle down to you. Or let's say, because I think a lot of what we're seeing recently is, really poorly written contracts because the goods were already duty free. And so you had a verbal confirmation with the foreign seller, and you didn't really think that you needed to kind of flesh out a contract or a terms and conditions on a PO. And now we're seeing, new clients who are like, I've never imported, I've never, gone through customs to import, but I'm now learning so much about the customs environment because my foreign seller is either asking me for more money, they're telling me my goods are detained, they're telling me they received an enforcement action and they want me to pay. And so these are kind of the things we're seeing is, a completely ignorant party because, they signed a contract, delivered duty paid, and the foreign seller probably did that because there is no duty. And they're like, yes, this is easy. And so now we're starting to see some worry from, U.S. importers. They're importers. They're the consignee of the goods. They're getting the goods and they're buying the goods, but they're not in control of the customs experience. Like they're not doing this with CBP. They're not making an entry. And so what they can do if you'd like to, and I think it's funny because, before this, we'd always tell our clients, yeah, if you don't have to be the IOR and you don't want to take on that compliance risk, don't. If your seller is willing to be listed as the IOR, that's a better circumstance. But now there's this added level of, because of how uncertain everything is, because your goods could be detained for months and months and you need them, there are some pluses to being the importer of record. At least that process is in your hands. If you had an issue with CBP, that's your call. You can call CBP and ask them, why is it being detained? Or you can make the argument, that the HTS classification is in fact correct or not correct. But when you're dealing with a foreign seller who sometimes might not even care about what's happening. Another anecdote is we had a client who, again, their Chinese supplier was like, I'm about to load your goods on the dock or on the ship, but I'm not doing it until you send me a check for the tariffs. And our client responded to them and said, well, this is delivered duty paid, and we have a agreed upon purchase price. So we're technically not obligated to send you more money for you to, go through with the shipment, with the purchase. And the Chinese supplier was kind of like, yeah, I understand it's delivered duty paid, but I'm not paying these tariffs. I'm not paying this 125% tariff. And granted, it wasn't supposed to be combative. They weren't trying to get into an argument. I think it was very similar to COVID times. It was just kind of like this is not either of our fault. Neither of us are in charge of putting on this 125% tariff plus. And so can you help me? Like, I want to give you these goods, but I can't keep running my business and, take on this 125% tariff plus. And when I say 125, I'm really just talking about that reciprocal tariff plus the IEEPA on fentanyl and then Section 301 and whatever else is compounded into that final duty rate. But that's kind of what we're seeing right now.
We learned a big lesson that obviously sometimes you need to make sure that your force majeure clause is solid. If I'm a buyer or a seller, depending on what side of the contract you're on. But also, do you think that now we're also learning or understanding that force majeure and maybe learning our lesson again, because now we're needing to add a bunch of these things? I mean, you keep on talking about all these different stacks that you're trying to answer. Do you think, what have you seen? Like, do you think like maybe somebody, or it was taken care of back then, when COVID hit? I mean, is that becoming a challenge?
Well, I haven't seen any client claim force majeure. I am seeing clients, or not clients, but I'm seeing their foreign sellers use a change in law provision, which is basically saying if there's a change in law, which is what is happening, the duty rate has now changed on certain goods, that I can change the purchase price. But if that provision is not listed in there, then they technically cannot change the purchase price. And I think another thing to add to this conversation is, let's say you're dealing with a foreign seller, but you have a U.S. agent. There is a connection to the United States that if you really wanted to, duke it out contract terms and conditions, you can. You have somebody who has a connection to the United States that you could receive some type of recourse from. But what if you're buying from a foreign party and they don't really care? And if you sue them, there's no way you can actually get them. You know what I'm saying? They are like, yeah, great, take us to court. We have no U.S. presence. Granted, if they want to continue importing into the United States with CBP, they kind of have to make sure everything's okay. But if we're not dealing with an enforcement action, we're really just dealing with a contract dispute. They might say, I don't care, from going forward, I'm just going to have all of my sellers, be the importer of record. And I don't really care what you're saying, or if you're going to take me to court, or, if you want to, I think arbitration is probably the safest. And I think most companies who are dealing with international parties are doing that. But you want to make sure that you have your contracts have teeth, And I get a lot of times what my clients are telling me is like, well, I've had this partner for 10 years. They're a good partner. We've always worked well together and we want to keep this partnership. And I think the step kind of going forward is it's not ugly to write contract terms that are clear and, even if they say too much, that's better than not saying enough, especially in this environment. And so you kind of want to pose it as, I'm protecting both of us. We're both wanting to continue this partnership, but we're dealing with two administrations, two countries that, are switching it up on us constantly. And so you really want good contract terms. And I've had a lot of clients who said, my contract is delivered duty paid. And I'm like, is it written down somewhere? And they're like, no, but we made that agreement verbally and they're the IOR. So that's how they're acting. And that's great. I mean, courts will abide by that, but why not have it in writing? You just want to make sure that everything is written down, and you want to make sure everything's written down in a way that it can be changed. I wouldn't enter in any purchase order agreement right now for a long period of time. I think those, you sometimes see purchase orders for millions of dollars where the shipments are going to come through for a year. I don't think that should happen anymore.
What do you look at as far as in doing something? You're even talking the purchase orders. To me, that's still the cost of the goods. The clearance and those higher tariffs are after the goods get in and they're being cleared. How do you handle that if it's a DDP type scenario to give flexibility? Say, okay, we understand there's going to be higher duties. We'll have to pay those higher duties as a buyer. How do you work through that?
You want to make sure you're not just relying on an Incoterm. So DDP is great and everybody thinks they understand what it means, but sometimes you have another party who's like, that's not how I interpreted that Incoterm. And when these contracts are enforced, Incoterms are great, but in the end of the day, if your terms and conditions negate or contradict your Incoterm, the terms and conditions are what kind of are the real teeth of the contract. And so I would say, make sure if you have DDP written down there, have it very explicitly stated. Person X is going to be the IOR and is going to be, in charge of clearing customs and paying duties. And if there are changes in, like, let's say you have a very long partnership and you guys are really entering in this contract to protect both of, you and them, you can have stipulations. Like if the price goes up again, or if, the tariffs go up again, you can decide right then and there, how are you going to divide that additional cost? What I would also say is be really, really careful about using templates or using, AI to come up with your contracts. You want to make sure that you're not using, because I could right now look up a force majeure clause or a change in law clause and just stick it into my contract and say, okay, great, I have this pretty language in there. But, I've seen some change in law clauses or some statements in contracts that say penalties on there and enforcement actions. And you as the US buyer could say, okay, fine, we're friends. If the tariffs go up again, I'm going to help you bear that cost. But you don't want to take on the cost of somebody's non-compliance. If they're claiming the HTS wrong and they're about to get hit with a penalty on top of the tariffs, that's not your problem. And it shouldn't be your problem.
It's like a quagmire. You can get snagged in it. I always say this though, is that when you are looking at talking about being explicit, what does DDP play? Who's doing what? I mean, who's paying the transportation? The seller, buyer, what? Who's paying for the duties and taxes and responsible for the clearance? Who's paying for any cargo insurance, or if it's if it's on a ship and the ship goes down, who's responsible? I mean, if you go through those scenarios and in the event that, again, you're expecting the seller is expecting buyer is expecting the seller to adhere to be compliant with the laws and regulations, so that you've got that very thing. Let's say somebody's using a different HTS code. Obviously, that is a big deal. And they're trying to circumvent, well, this doesn't qualify for the 232s if we use this HTS number. Well, now you got a problem. Like you said, it's a compliance issue, and you don't want, as a U.S. entity, to be tagged with that. Unfortunately, you're already going to be part of that in an association, because your EIN number is going to be listed as the ultimate consignee, usually on a DDP transaction. So there is some risk in that. But on the same token, again, as you're talking through this, those are the things that, to our listeners, folks, this is a conversation you need to have with your compliance needs to be talking to your purchasing group or your sourcing group, along with your transportation folks, so that when you look at things, to me, when a shipment comes off the dock, the way that, and you'll have your commercial invoice, and I understand it, and I think you're right on the money, Marina. It's fantastic to say, don't just rely on the Incoterm. Make sure your Incoterm matches what your terms and conditions are of the contract. But here's the other thing. How is the bill of lading filled out? The ocean bill of lading, the air bill for air cargo or air express, whatever. Who's paying the transportation? Who's paying the duties and taxes? Who's listed on there as the parties? That makes a difference when it comes to compliance. And you better make sure that your bill of lading is synchronized with your commercial invoice. Would you agree with that?
And I think that you just reminded me, I think a lot of people were thinking, before today, when the tariffs were really high, is, okay, I need a quick solution. This is, as you guys are both saying, these are not like we're discussing changes to tariffs and then they come into play 5 months from now. It's like we're announcing them and then within 2 days they're enforceable. And so we have clients who've been wanting, quick fixes. And so when they were bringing things in duty free or under a free trade agreement or, under an exclusion, whatever it is, they weren't worried about this stuff. And now that these tariffs are really high, they're kind of going back to the drawing board and they're like, okay, well, am I claiming value correctly? Could I be over claiming value? And so a lot of clients have come to us and said, I'm hearing about first sale rule. Does this apply to me? Like, can I use first sale rule? I have, there is an intermediary in this transaction. Okay, cool. But as you're saying, okay, do your documents match what your kind of first sale rule is great. And a lot of, companies could be using it and are not, but who's assuming risk of your shipment? Because if it's not the right person, then first sale rule does not apply. How is title being transferred between you and the buyer and any, middle person? So I think we're all trying to be creative. And I will say, I've seen a lot of seller-buyer disputes right now. Maybe only one of them has gotten slightly contentious. But for the most part, I think we're in a really good place right now where both sides are feeling it. And so this is a really great time to, go back to your contracts. I think verbal agreements are just, assumptions are not, you just can't do that right now with the uncertainty. And I think I was talking to a colleague of mine and we're kind of thinking you want to be flexible in your contracts right now, but you kind of also want them to be very, very clear. And so how do you do both at the same time? Like, you want to be able to get out of something if it's not serving either party or it's really hurting one party or the other. But you also want to make sure that, your partner isn't maybe going to come back to you and say, well, this wasn't clearly written, and so please send me a check. But I think I think long-term contracts are probably not the best. They're not the most ideal right now, but also even putting language in your contract to say, okay, if either of our governments, increase the tariffs over a certain level, let's say that this contract is up for renegotiation at that point. And so that way you can be as clear as you need to be, but you're also allowing some room to say, okay, this is no longer fair to either of us because the tariffs either went really low or really high. And so you want to make contracts that protect you in the good times and the bad times. And I think we're going to see a lot of this. And my prediction is, we're friends with China today. we might not be friends with them tomorrow, or maybe we'll be, maybe it won't be 125% plus anymore, but maybe there'll be another country. Maybe we're going to have a tiff with India in a couple of months. And so that's another thing is, okay, well, I'm seeing a lot of my clients moving processing to other countries and make movements that way. And so if they're in the middle of that, agreement with a party, and now we've just announced another drop in tariffs, we kind of need to build in that room for ourselves in these contracts.
It gives you flexibility. Here's one thing I was going to ask you, Lalo, out of this with what Marina was saying, is that with so much change going on, to update systems appropriately is going to be probably the IT folks are probably going, they may not even be at the table yet. The compliance people are trying so hard to keep up with things. And I guess, Marina, that's another question is like going through this is as you're dealing with all this, what about your systems? What should it reflect and all that, trying to keep that up to date? I don't know, Lalo, what do you suggest as far as, getting people from IT to the table? Is that something that'd be appropriate in this?
That's actually a good point that you're saying, Andy, because I had in my mind, I was going to ask Marina also, I guess in their disputes and what it is that they're looking at when they're talking to clients, again, be it the seller or the buyer, we like to talk a lot about the trade culture. Andy and I like to talk a lot about that. We do here at Global Training Center. That's like pretty much a underlying foundation of training that we do, is that we say that they need to have a trade culture, meaning it's not just the trade team, that's going to be learning about how to do an import or how to classify or anything. I mean, of course, you don't necessarily need the purchasing person know how to classify, or the person in sales. They just need to know what you're doing. But that's what I mean, is that culture needs to go out throughout the company. So have you seen, are you mostly dealing with, like Andy says, the trade person because they're cleaning up after the parade? They're cleaning up all the stuff that happened because of somebody didn't negotiate. Are you seeing sales departments now getting more involved, or purchasing departments now getting more involved, of course, depending on what side of the contract you're on, so that they could understand that what DDP really means, and not just the salesperson right away saying, yeah, don't worry, we'll do DDP just to get the sale. You know what I'm saying? And so that tends to happen. Have you been seeing that where maybe you are getting more buy-in, like Andy said, other departments stepping up and understood as well, that they are understanding that what the implications might be?
Definitely. I'm not just talking to compliance persons anymore. I'm talking to people in the C-suite, a lot for these disputes, obviously, because somebody higher up now gets involved and they're saying kind of what's going on. We're talking, right now we're saying, both sides are affected. We want this to be a contract renegotiation where both parties are protected. But that's kind of preventative. And if you're in the middle of a dispute, and that's kind of where I'm seeing a lot of people outside of compliance join that conversation, because at that point we're kind of already in trouble, or, we're in this weird hot water area. That's when you kind of have to explain to each party, okay, now we're in something a little bit more serious, and we have to be careful how we, talk about the contract, how we talk about our obligations kind of going forward. So that's something that, our firm has been mindful about explaining to every single, person in that company who's wearing a different hat. Because, if you're procurement, you're thinking, vendor relationship. If you're in the C-suite, you're thinking, large, big picture. If I'm talking to compliance, it's a completely different worry that they have. They're worried about okay, well, if there's an enforcement action, can they come back and, put that on us? And so that's something that, kind of every party has to realize is there's a difference between being preventative and making sure our contracts look good for the future and for the uncertainty. And there's a different discussion to be had when you're in the middle of the dispute. Somebody has already kind of pulled out the contract and is like, you owe me money. Well, I'd like to just give listeners a couple of recommendations. Obviously, I'm not giving any legal advice. But just for going forward, if you don't have contracts in place, I would say, even if we're starting to see a little relief on the tariff side, it's still, there's uncertainty. These are only, these decreases in tariffs on China are on a 90-day, basis. And so in the uncertainty, you need to have clear, explicit contract terms and conditions. Make sure that there's no contradictions within your contract, and give yourself some breathing room within those contracts. Put clauses in them that allow for renegotiation, every quarter or whenever a new tariff rate happens, or if there's a change in law, require in the contract that there be a renegotiation. I would also suggest making sure that you have arbitration clauses, that you have an attorney review your contracts and terms. Be prepared for the enforcement environment. So if you don't have transparency and you are not the importer of record, but you will be, affected by higher tariffs that will either result in goods being detained or higher purchase prices, maybe even allow yourself some more transparency in your contracts. Require that you get to see the HTS code that they're using, and that you get to be involved in what tariffs that they're paying. Because that's kind of another thing that could be worrisome, is you're not doing anything wrong, but your buyers or your sellers' non-compliance is now affecting your own due dates and your own issues, your own contract terms with somebody else. And I would include indemnification agreements or indemnification clauses in your contracts to also kind of, if you can, and if it doesn't hurt that partnership, I would include those as well. And you're obviously going to enter into agreements with, parties that you've done business with for, quite a long time. But if you're about to enter an agreement with somebody for the first time, with an entity you've never done business with it, I would do test contract agreements and test shipments. You kind of want somebody to build trust with you before you enter into a large purchase order.
Marina, that's some excellent advice. Folks, you need to be listening to this. This is going to be a show that you probably need to flag and go back and listen to and share it with folks from several different areas in your company and or even small business owners and whatnot, because this is very, very important. Lalo and I both just greatly appreciate everything, all your support. So with that, have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show, or would like to sponsor Simply Trade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.